Welcome to the new year. We are beginning our studies today with the first book of Kings. This is our first section, and it's covering chapters 1 and 2. So we're talking about the transition of power in Israel. We have seen the rule of King David, and now we're going to follow up on the transition of David to his son Solomon and how that takes place. But first, let's take a look at how much we have done so far. Since we started this study of the Old Testament, we followed this road path and taken a look at things beginning with creation as appropriate, and following through Genesis and all the way through the lives of the patriarchs in Genesis, and then the movement from Mesopotamia into Egypt. And from there, we, of course, spent time in Egypt and how the people lived there. And then we have the birth of Moses and the story of the Exodus from Egypt going into and towards the promised land that was given to a promise to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. So we've covered a lot of territory. Literally, we have wandered through the wilderness and we've entered the promised land and had some difficulties accomplishing that. And then we had some settling down in the new lands and appropriation of tribal lands, and over them were the ruling of the judges. The judges was kind of a prelude to kings, and now we are in the era of the time of the kings. So the first king, remember, was Saul. He was kind of somewhere not quite a king like we think of, sitting in a palace with, on his throne with all of the paraphernalia that goes with that, but still kind of a bridge between a tribal leader and a king. And then we had King David, who was the first one to rule from a capital city that he created in Jerusalem. And now we are transitioning from David to Solomon. Okay, so that's how far we've traveled. It's a long time. We've studied a lot of material up to this time. So here we go, another map or timeline for you. This is a little bit hard to read, I know, probably, but covers kind of the same idea. Here's Genesis and some of the main characters, and then Exodus, and then the time at Mount Sinai where the law is given, which is an important transition for Israel to be set apart and to receive the law of God. And we studied Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And so the area that we are studying now is all under what is described as the Deuteronomic histories. So we looked at the leaders of Moses and Joshua. Then we went into the judges. We had a little story of Ruth and Naomi, and then we go to a transition of Samuel, and Samuel was somewhere between a judge, a priest, and he anoints the first king of Israel, and that would be Saul. Parallel to 1st and 2nd Samuel are the first books of Chronicles, and then some of the Psalms, which of course we often associate with David, but there are some associated with King Solomon as well, and other writers. So now we are right here, where it says David and Solomon. We're just to the end of David, so we're basically on this line to Solomon and Solomon's reign, and then from there we are going to find out that there is a split between northern and southern areas of Israel. And so we'll have two separate kingdoms, a southern kingdom, which is called Judah, and a northern kingdom, which is called Israel. All right, so from there, we are going to step into the transition from David to Solomon. One of the most important things that comes out of our study of King David was a promise that was made in 2 Samuel chapter 7 to David. And that promise includes in it the development of the term Masha, which is later transitions into the term Messiah. So it is from the covenant that God made with David over Israel that the hope of a Messiah to fulfill a promise to carry out David's dynasty and that they would rule forever. So this idea of Messiah comes from this promise. And particularly keep that in mind as we go forward in our studies and things seem to not go as well for Israel as was hoped. So Jesus is from the line of David, and a hope was set upon a Messiah who would fulfill this promise of a new king for Israel. And here's how it reads in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 11 and 12. The promise included, "Furthermore, the Lord declares that he will make a house for you, a dynasty of kings. For when you die and are buried with your ancestors, I will raise up one of your descendants, your own offspring, and I will make his kingdom strong. He is the one who will build a house, a temple for my name, and I will secure his royal throne forever." Between the story of the Exodus, which is a real basic security and starting point for Israel, and this promise of the carrying on of David's royal line forever, they are two of the most important things in the Old Testament and understanding what's happening and how the people believe. So let's look at some of the background for the books of the Kings. In the Christian Bible, the Book of Kings are part of the Deuteronomic history. In the Hebrew Bible, they are considered part of the former prophets because of the role prophets have in association with the early kings. The books are neither straight history or prophecy. They are a narrative that tries to explain the theological reasons for the demise of Israel and Judah. The stories of Israel and Judah's kings are told to support the reasons that Israel did not succeed as a nation. So when these stories are written and told, they look back upon Israel's past and try to explain why the kingdom of Israel did not hold up and why it didn't continue as a nation. So this is a theological reason for why Judah and Israel were carried off into the exile years. There are two time periods for the books of Kings 1 and 2. That we know as Kings 1 and 2 were authored anonymously during these two time periods. The beginning section, the bulk of material, was compiled around 620 BCE in the city of Jerusalem. And the second portion was added sometime around 560 BCE during the Babylonian exile years. So two distinct sources of time. And the source materials are many and they are varied. There are references to the annals from the kings of both the northern and southern kingdoms. And there are stories about the prophets Elijah and Elisha, and there are the regnal summaries of each king's reign. And there are even other sources. that were taken into account when the compilation of these stories were written down as the books of Kings. Now remember back to David's choices. So we're just kind of recalling a little bit of background again. David's choice of Jerusalem as a capital was a calculated one. The city had belonged neither to the tribes of Judah or to the tribes of Israel. It was in Jerusalem that David united the various tribal confederacies north and south. There he had ruled with a coalition of old guards from Judah, and new personnel in Jerusalem were drawn from a variety of backgrounds. So looking at the support that David has, there are two high priests, Abiathar and Zadok, and two military commanders, Joab and Benaiah. One apparently was in charge of the militia, and the other was commanding the professional troops. You'll remember Joab because we've discussed him a number of times in the past. Interestingly, the books of Kings report the death of David, and then, just like back in time, Exodus and Samuel in the past, the narrative story begins with a strong woman character. In Exodus, we had Moses' mother. In Samuel, we had Hannah. In Kings, we start out with Bathsheba. The prophet Nathan and Bathsheba set a plan before King David to make Solomon the heir, even while the son who was actually next in the royal succession was also making plans to become the king. So we have a conflict of interest here of who is going to be the king. So we're presented with a predicament at this point. Who will be the heir to the throne of David, which God had promised would be established forever? Immediately after the account of David's physical and mental condition, we read that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, is elevating himself because Adonijah says, I will be king. Adonijah is the fourth of David's sons who were born to him in the town of Hebron. Remember, Hebron is where David first set up his kingdom for 7 years, and several of his children were born there. So David's firstborn, if you recall, was Ammon, and he was the one who raped his half-sister Tamar and then was killed by Absalom. Absalom was the third son, and he was banished for murder and killed when he was trying to usurp the throne of his father. Because just like Adonijah, he had at one time tried to usurp the throne from David. And we don't know anything basically about Chaleb, who was the second son. We can only just conjecture that possibly he died in childhood. In any case, Adonijah is the oldest surviving son of David at this time, and he is the presumed heir if we're following traditional primogeniture rules for the heir being the oldest son. So there's some comparisons here between Absalom and Adonijah, both sons who tried to take the throne from David, even while he was still alive. So Adonijah attempted a coup d'etat that recalls a previous violent push by another son of David. That was Absalom. And like Absalom, Adonijah is said to be very handsome. And also Absalom and Adonijah both gather for themselves chariots and horses and royal escorts and make it known that and visible who they are to the people. And like Absalom, Adonijah invites others to a sacrificial feast. outside of Jerusalem. Adonijah was born next after Absalom, meaning probably that Adonijah is the heir presumptive by primogeniture. And that is in 2 Samuel 12 through 14. So an aged David is also no longer apparently in control of his house. Rather, he seems to be at the mercy of his courtiers and requires a governess to take care of him. And the stage is set then for the transfer of power and authority from David to a successor. So Nathan and Bathsheba seem to be taking advantage of David's senility. Nathan suggests that Bathsheba would ask David if the king himself had not sworn to her that Solomon would be his successor. Bathsheba tells David that Adonijah has become the king without his knowledge. He does not know that Adonijah is plotting to take over his throne. The lack of knowledge on David's part is telling because the king was once assumed to have had great wisdom. In 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 28 to 30, David makes Solomon the king in this way. And David responded and called for Bathsheba. So she came back in and stood before the king. And the king repeated his vow, "As surely as the Lord lives, who has rescued me from every danger, your son Solomon will be the next king and will sit on my throne this very day, just as I vowed to you before the Lord, the God of Israel." That's an interesting verse because nothing is said of an oath to Bathsheba that Solomon would be made heir following David's death. The succession of Solomon to the throne is not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible, which would be completely surprising given that the importance of such a tradition to the monarchy and the importance of the Davidic monarchy. So it's apparent that Nathan and Bathsheba may have been plotting some palace intrigue here. Nowhere does it say that Nathan has consulted God or that David has asked Nathan to consult God about the transition of power from himself to one of his sons. So it's a human endeavor. So David instructs Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah, the commander of the royal guard in Jerusalem, three persons who are not implicated in the conspiracy with Adonijah. And they are to install Solomon as the king and ruler. In stark contrast to the divisive and provincial assembly of Adonijah, which was attended by Judeans only, Solomon is said to have been installed amid pomp and circumstances, all marking the legitimacy of his ascension over the whole country, over Israel and over Judah. And Solomon was placed upon David's own mule, the mule having become a status symbol in those days. He is publicly anointed with the oil from the tent, that no doubt was referring to the movable tent of meeting, or what was called the tent of Yahweh, that had been the symbol of divine presence in the midst of Israel. And this way he was anointed just as Solomon and David had been. So ceremonies take place near the spring of Gihon, beneath the city of David. Those are the ceremonies for Solomon. But Adonijah's feast is held at another spring outside of the city. Throughout the account, the narrator presents Adonijah's actions as having arisen from his own ambition and personal will. Adonijah exalts himself, openly declaring his wish to be the king, and prepared for himself the trappings of a kingship, and approached his co-conspirators himself. And this is a map. It may be looking a little bit confusing, but at least we can kind of get a picture of the ancient city of David, the walls around it, and the two springs. Here is where Solomon is having his anointing, and down here is where Adonijah is having his feast. Even though this may look large, it's not really very big distance. And you can tell by the contour lines that it's a little hilly, because the closer together the lines are, the steeper it is. And so this is the valley down in here, and this is the water source. Okay. Over here, you can really see the water source, the spring of Gihon up here. And then you can see how they've diverted some of the water to come around and come into a pool that serves the city of Jerusalem. All right, so kind of a big overview of what the lay of the land is. I do like this one up here where it says the modern dung gate. Not sure what the origin of that is, but you can use your imagination. Is God working through Nathan the prophet? Or is Nathan looking to his own interests when he collaborated with Bathsheba to make Solomon the king? What was Bathsheba's goal in all of this? And think back to the promise of a Messiah from David's house. We know that apparently there's no record of Nathan consulting for any divine advice regarding this choice. And so we just have to wonder, is this the way God is working? Is there God's divine plan behind all of this? Or is it just man's plotting? The text is a historical narrative, recall, written from a particular social and political viewpoint. So we must always remember histories are written from certain points of view. There's no evidence in the story itself of a theological message here. There's no suggestion of a direct divine intervention. And there's no divine manifestation, no direct word from on high, not even communication from God delivered by a messenger. Bathsheba and Nathan conspired to deny Adonijah the throne and to win it for Solomon. So political divisiveness. Whereas, again, Adonijah, we know, exalted himself. Solomon was exalted by others and by God, as we'll see in the future. That is the simple conclusion of the story. One who tries to elevate himself is brought down, and one who does nothing to promote himself is exalted. It is God's will that will be done, not the will of an ambitious prince. This story poses a particular dilemma of faith, whether to believe that there is a divine purpose behind and despite such scandalous events in history. So there's a lot to think about there, because through history, we've seen an awful lot of things. And if we believe that God is behind and working through people in history, then this gives us a lot of food for thought from the Old Testament. And then David's final words: praise the Lord, the God of Israel, who today has chosen a successor to sit on my throne while I am still alive to see it. In 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, summarized, David gives Solomon advice and commands him to follow the Mosaic laws. As Solomon does this, he will prosper as a king. And in verse 4, if your descendants live as they should and follow me faithfully with all their heart and soul, one of them will always sit on the throne of Israel. And starting with verse 10, then David died and was buried with his ancestors in the city of David. David had reigned over Israel for 40 years. 7 of them were in Hebron and 33 in Jerusalem. And Solomon became the king and sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. And there is still continued challenges to Solomon and his reign. Adonijah is still alive. He's not king, but he's still David's son, oldest surviving son. So I have to keep that in mind. So Adonijah has the support of 2 very influential Judean officials. One is Abiathar, the priest, and the other is our well-known Joab, the military commander. Both of them are supported by the free elements in the kingdom, whereas Zadok and Benaiah are the retainers that were appointed by David when he was the king. Solomon swears in the name of the Lord and invokes the Lord's promise to David, promising that Adonijah will be put to death for his conduct. Remember that Adonijah was earlier spared his life only on the condition of his loyalty to Solomon. So David had instructed a number of different things to Solomon about people that he should eliminate that would possibly be danger to his reign as a king and his security. But Solomon was a little bit soft of heart and didn't directly do this or immediately do this. So we still have Adonijah, who is still alive. We have Abiathar, the priest, and Joab, the military commander. They are all still alive, even though Solomon is now anointed and seated on the throne of David. And so now we have this thing from Adonijah. He approaches Bathsheba, who would be like a stepmother to him, right? Because she was David's wife, she's Solomon's mother, or maybe an aunt or a stepmother, I'm not sure which, but anyway. And now Adonijah approaches Bathsheba and asks her to go to King Solomon with this request. And so Solomon says, "What is it, my mother?" to Bathsheba. "You know that I won't refuse you." So then she says, "Let your brother Adonijah marry Ashig, the girl from Shunem." And Solomon is very angry and responds, "How can you possibly ask me to give Abishag to Adonijah?" King Solomon demanded. "You might as well ask me to give him the kingdom. You know he's my older brother, and that he has Abiathar the priest and Joab the son of Zeruiah on his side." So that may not sound like it means much, but if we take a little deeper look at this, remembering that Adonijah is older and that Abishag is a girl from the harem of David. Now the deal is off, Solomon says, his present quest being evidence to Solomon that Adonijah is not a person of substance after all. So Solomon sends Benaiah, his hatchet man, to kill Adonijah and put an end to whatever claims his brother may have towards the throne. Whereas David had been weak and indulgent to Adonijah, Solomon is strong and he acts boldly. Eventually, all 3 of them will be killed by the command of Solomon. So after this incident with Adonijah, Solomon realized that he must remove the old factions in order to remain secure in his position. He removes the priest who advised Adonijah, and he was the last of the house of Eli, being exiled. Joab is also removed. but he is executed according to verses 20 through 35 in 1 Kings chapter 2. And supposedly the reason that he is killed is because he killed Abner, the son, the commander, and his rival, and Amasa, Abner's brother. And then also remember that he's the one who stabbed Absalom, who was hanging in the tree. So let's take a look at why this matters. Why does it matter that Adonijah asks for this particular person to be his wife, this particular girl? Remember, she is in the king's harem. She was one of David's concubines. Even if she was young and he had never had relations with her, she still belongs to him technically in his harem. So she's like a possession, sort of like a wife, but just not an active wife, so to speak. Then the king said to Abiathar the priest, and this is Solomon, go back to your home in Anathoth. So he's dealt with Adonijah and has had him killed, but now he's dealing with Abiathar the priest. He said, you deserve to die, and I will not kill you now because you carried the ark of the sovereign Lord for David my father, and you shared all of his hardships. So he had been loyal to King David. And Solomon deposed Abiathar from his position as the priest of the Lord, thereby fulfilling the prophecy the Lord had given in Shiloh concerning the descendants of Eli, saying that they would no longer be any descendants of Eli on the role of priest. And so what does all of this mean? In the days of royal harems, taking possessions of a king's concubines was a declaration of one's right to the throne. This had been one of Absalom's methods when he led a coup against David back in 2 Samuel 16. Since Abishai was considered part of David's harem, her marriage to Adonijah would have strengthened his claim to the throne. And where have we seen this in the past? David, having succeeded Saul, is now said to have been given your master's house and your master's wives into your bosom. Then, when Absalom was rebelling against David, he was counseled by an advisor to have intercourse with his father's concubines who he had left to keep the house. This is when David was fleeing with his entourage into the wilderness to get away from Absalom, who was going to take over the throne. And all Israel will hear that you have become odious to your father, and all your supporters will be encouraged. So having control of the harem is a way of showing that you are in control of the kingship. All right, we're going to take a look at a video here, kind of an overview. I know that was kind of a fast and quick transition. And let's take a little more archaeological look at this whole thing. We'll watch about 13 minutes.
The world of King Solomon is a hotly debated subject in archaeological circles today. Did Israel truly become the regional powerhouse during this period, as the Bible would have it, or are there other factors at play? Regardless of their historical grounding, one thing we know for sure is that the stories of Solomon are among the most beautiful and fascinating verses in the Bible. The first thing that Solomon did, says the Bible, was to consolidate his power and secure his throne. His rivals were still at large, and they had the backing of the army as well as the tribes in the north. The problem was Solomon couldn't just move against Adonijah and arrest him, because that had the real danger of provoking the rebellion he was trying to prevent. What to do, what to do. In the end, Adonijah himself gave Solomon the perfect pretext. As it happened, he had developed a sweet spot for a lovely young woman named Abishag, who had nursed David in his final days. Even though the first book of Kings denies this, it was widely assumed at court that she had also been David's concubine, and that made her a very powerful woman. So when Adonijah approached Solomon for permission to marry his father's confidant, that naturally started all sorts of rumors. The reason is that concubines could wield tremendous power at a court in ancient times. So any attempt to solicit such ladies, even if her original royal suitor was dead, could be considered a challenge to the authority of the ruling king. Why not ask for the kingdom as well? Solomon said to his mother. But now he had the pretext he needed. Adonijah was arrested and put to death. Other prominent figures of his faction, including the high priest and the head of the army, were either banished or put to the sword. That's how things were done. A king could not ignore any threat to the legitimacy of his crown. But, says the Bible, this bloody purge did affect Solomon deeply. He went on a private retreat, made sacrifices, and prayed for God's guidance. In a dream, Yahweh then asked Solomon what he wished to have. The young king replied, "Give your servant an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil." So rather than wealth, power, or a long life, Solomon asked for wisdom. That may seem unusual, but not as much as you might think. In the ancient Near East, wisdom was considered the most important attribute of a ruler. Its superior intellect and judgment that qualified him or her to be king or queen. That's how Hammurabi created his famous code, for example. And according to the Bible, Solomon did prove himself to be what today we could call a hands-on leader. He reorganized the kingdom into 12 districts, which deliberately cut across tribal boundaries, and then appointed professional administrators rather than tribal chieftains to further centralize his control of the kingdom. The key motive for this, of course, was to improve the collection of taxes, which didn't exactly endear him to the tribal elders. And then Solomon reached out to the bordering states and began to develop a dense network of trade. Before long, says the first book of Kings, his kingdom was a leading player in the trade and politics of the Middle East. Now, at first glance, that all seems very plausible. By the mid-10th century, trade in the Near East was indeed recovering from the devastation of the Sea Peoples. Even the Philistines were now using their nautical skills to become traders across the sea. And that trade was further boosted by the introduction of two revolutionary means of transport. The first was the development of the galley, a flat-bottomed ship with a curved bow or stern developed by the Phoenicians, who were at that time the masters of the Mediterranean trade. The galley was agile, it was light, it could be propelled by sail or by oars, and best of all, you could take these vessels along the coast or on a river, which expedited the transfer of goods from the Mediterranean to inland waterways. And since their bow often featured the head of a horse, the ships later became known as hippoi, or horses in Greek. The second major revolution, as we saw, was the domestication of camels. And as we saw, that didn't happen to any significant degree until the 10th century. But then this creature revolutionized land-based travel, replacing the donkey as the favorite beast of burden. The camel was, and still is, truly a ship of the desert. A camel was capable of traveling for 14 days without nourishment of any kind. Its thick coat, which was often used to make garments, protected the animal from the sun, while its broad feet gave it extra purchase on the sand. Its flat nostrils and long eyelashes also protected the head against wind and sand. The English word camel is actually derived from the Arabic word jamal, or the Hebrew gamal. With these two innovations, Solomon could begin to leverage Israel's unique position at the nexus between Egypt in the south and Mesopotamia in the north. As we saw in preceding centuries, Canaan had been a mere toll booth on the caravan route. But now, says the Bible, Israel became a trading power in its own right. Solomon signed a treaty with the Phoenicians to build their new boats under license, as we would say today, using the wharves of Ezion Geber, today's Eilat. Crewing these ships was a bit of a problem because obviously the Israelites had little or no naval experience. Fortunately, says 1 Kings, the Phoenician king sent sailors who were familiar with the sea to serve with the servants of Solomon. And so a fleet of ships began to sail through the blue waters of the Gulf of Aqaba on their way to Africa. There, says the Bible, Solomon had discovered a highly valuable resource, the gold ores of Ophir on the east coast of Africa. The Bible claims that just in 1 year alone, these gold revenues amounted to 666 talents, which is roughly the equivalent of 50,000 pounds of gold. A mind-blowing number. And these are wonderful stories. But the question is, if Solomon's kingdom was so rich and so powerful, why don't we see much evidence of that on the ground? That question has spurred a lively debate between scholars. So one group claims that Solomon is probably a legendary figure who combines all the virtues of a Davidic king, as well as the aspirations of Israel as a powerful nation. And then there is another group who believes that there is archaeological evidence, but that much of it was destroyed in the later wars with Assyria, or built over in later periods. So I think that to some extent, both views are right. Just as in the case of David, there are tantalizing fragments that can conceivably be traced back to a ruler named Solomon. But on the other hand, much of the narrative has suffered probably from exaggeration by later scribes, who were keen to show that Israel was once a great and powerful nation, and that all that King Josiah was trying to do was restore that greatness in the 7th century. Now, the search for archaeological evidence should start with Megiddo and Hazor. As we saw, both were strategic fortresses that had always controlled the most fertile valleys in Israel, the Jezreel, and the Galilee. Both Megiddo and Hazor were first excavated by the legendary Yigal Yadin in the 1950s, followed by other archaeologists in the decades since. Now, the Bible says that Solomon restored these forts and manned them with garrisons. And indeed, both Megiddo and Hazor have a monumental gateway that is almost identical in design. Both feature a long and narrow passage flanked by 3 large chambers on either side, which were probably used to house guards with their weapons. These heavy ashlar stones and the way they are fitted together point to new engineering ideas, perhaps even a new style designed by Solomon's architects. But some historians have argued that the design of the gate is not unique and that it can be found elsewhere in the Near East, for example, Phoenicia. That may be true, but that doesn't rule out the possibility that Solomon's architects simply brought these designs back from their travels abroad. So you see, there are no absolutes in biblical archaeology. After all, these are monuments that are around 3,000 years old, and very often new discoveries tend to challenge old assumptions. And the same is true for what Yadin found on the other side of the Megiddo fortress. Another debate is raging with regard to the area right next to the palace precinct of Megiddo, which Yadin also dated to the time of Solomon. At first glance, this appears to be an exercise yard bordered by stables. Each of these is furnished with a hollow stone block that may be a feeding trough. Sure enough, the first book of Kings tells us that Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses and 12,000 horsemen, enough for some 4,000 chariots. So naturally, Yadin identified them as Solomon's stables. But, and there is always a but, isn't there? We have new research that argues that all this was built much later, possibly in the 9th century. These modern authors argue that very similar facilities have been found in Hazor, and that these are reliably dated to the time of King Ahab. Whatever you may think about the wealth or size of Solomon's kingdom, there is one thing that I think we can reliably attribute to the time of Solomon.
All right, we will leave off there for now and take the rest of that up when we get to the point of the temple. But for now, at least we have a little bit of background and a little bit of what's coming up in the future. And I always think the visuals are helpful, and I hope you like them as well. So for next week, our reading is in 1 Kings chapters 3 and 4, and we'll learn about the wisdom of Solomon. And in addition, if you have an opportunity, read Psalm 103, which is a psalm of praise by David. In our verse for today, I was thinking about the passing of President Carter, and I came across this particular one. So I decided to use it for this week as a verse of the day. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on your work and muse on your mighty deeds. From Psalm 77, verses 11 and 12. And President Carter said, "We appreciate the past. We are grateful for the present, and we're looking forward to the future with great anticipation and commitment." wise words. And a prayer for today, may we reflect on the past with gratitude and recognition of God's work. And I hope you have a wonderful week, and I'll see you back for the next lesson soon. And I'll leave you with this little bit of funny.